Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, uncovering the hidden ideas that form us, church, and the culture. I'm Brian Fisher, coming to you from Fish Tank Studios, just outside of Dallas, Texas. This is episode 90, Kingdom Dwellers, and today we're going to be talking about the characteristic of being an idea revolutionary. Okay, we're rounding out this little mini-series on these qualities of being a deep disciple. Deep disciple is someone whose life is organized around becoming more like Jesus, that we are slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, steadily being formed to think like he thinks, to relate like he relates, and to love like he loves. It's our ongoing journey of spiritual formation, or heart formation, or even character formation. So hopefully, we're taking this journey together with our close community. Discipleship is best as a group effort. We're in season 4, which is all about the forgotten kingdom. The kingdom of God is a primary theme of the Bible, yet many followers of Jesus don't have a clear picture of what it actually is. Understanding the kingdom is all about gaining clarity on Jesus' purpose and mission, and therefore our purpose and our mission. So far this season, we've explored some definitions of the kingdom, and then we took a look at how our ideas about the end times impact our assumptions about the kingdom. That was fascinating. You may remember our discussion on splitters and joiners a few episodes ago. And for the last several weeks, we've been exploring Jesus and his initial followers and uncovering some qualities of someone whose life is centered on seeking the kingdom first. A deep disciple is courageously curious. They invite themselves and others to dig into the ideas and desires that power and govern us. They genuinely want to know and serve people's hearts. Deep disciples are often particular. They seek out and pay careful attention to the individual. In a world filled with systems and numbers and obsessions about populations and groups, a deep disciple bends towards each unique, extremely valuable person. They practice releasing control. They give up trying to figure everything out and trying to control people or situations. Ouch. They practice being restful even in the midst of difficult tension. They typically don't find that rest by quoting isolated Bible verses or Christian euphemisms. They find that rest through wrestling with God and maybe even themselves. And deep disciples are growing and learning to suffer well. We learn to suffer authentically. We're honest and open about our pain. And we learn to suffer in community, inviting trusted friends to suffer with us as we suffer with them. The last characteristic of Jesus and deep disciples we're going to explore is that they are idea revolutionaries. They learn to identify ideas in the air and ideas in the soil, and they intentionally work to transform dark ideas into light ideas. If you've been with us on this Soil and Roots journey for any length of time, you're well versed in the world of ideas. It's where a deep disciple often lives. So to review, an idea is an assumption, a conclusion, a principle in which our hearts are rooted, but of which many of us aren't aware. Ideas and desires sit at the bottom of our hearts, and they power and govern who we are and how we operate in the world. They're not so much intellectual conclusions as they are experienced realities. It takes a while to get our arms around the concept of ideas, but once we do, we become pretty good at uncovering them. I know, this is not the way we normally talk about Christianity or theology or even discipleship. But this concept of ideas is nothing new. It's been explored, debated, and taught by philosophers and theologians for centuries. And we've explored numerous examples of ideas over the past few years right here. One of the most common examples of an idea that doesn't align with our stated belief is the assumption, the functioning idea, that we need to earn God's favor. We say over and over again that our salvation, Our redemption, our intimate relationship with God is purely a matter of his mercy and grace, and yet many of us function from the idea that we need to do this, go here, hit this mark, attend this conference, take this sacrament, to keep ourselves in God's good favor. Recently, I was speaking with a woman who runs her own Christian media ministry. She was convinced that every time that she sinned, God withheld donations to her ministry. The only way she could earn her way back into his good graces was to figure out how to stop sinning and do more ministry. And yet, she evangelized all sorts of people, assuring them that their salvation and status with God was purely a result of Jesus' action and not ours. Her idea, her functioning bedrock assumption, didn't align with her belief. She wasn't even aware of it. Most of us aren't. So how did her heart come to embrace the idea that her status with God was based on her performance? Well, could be for any number of reasons. She most likely grew up in a home where her acceptance, her being known, her sense of security was based on how she performed. People who grew up in performance-based homes or shame-based cultures will often struggle to live with Christ in such a way that truly rests in him. We will swear up and down that we do our good works because we're responding to his love, and yet the signs are there that we're internally afraid he'll leave us or reject us if we just don't measure up. I know what that feels like because it's an idea that I've struggled with myself. These types of corrupt ideas can exhaust us. They can deflate us, and sometimes we're not even aware of what's going on. We just feel disconnected or ill at ease, or that something just isn't right in our relationships. This is deep stuff. We don't unearth these hidden ideas without self-exploration, without self-knowledge, what A.W. Tozer called a painful self-probing. And for many of us today, that's just not on the menu. We've explored two major categories of ideas here: ideas in the air and ideas in the soil. Ideas in the air are those assumptions that float around culture and creation. We live in them. We breathe them. We're exposed to them all day, every day. They permeate all 7 mountains of culture. We may or may not notice them, but they are impacting us in a myriad of ways. If you live in a democracy, you live in an era of ideas that includes things like freedom, independence, autonomy, rights. But if you lived in any number of ancient cultures, none of those ideas would have crossed your radar, wouldn't have even bothered you. Your heart wouldn't have known there anything different existed. This is why studying the prevailing ideas of the cultures in which the Bible was written is so vital for understanding Scripture. From Moses to John, the cultures they were writing in were breathing very different air than we do today. And if we don't understand their ideas in the air, we end up transposing our unconscious ideas onto the text, and then we're going to get ourselves in trouble. Now, ideas in the soil are those that seep down into our hearts, and they form who we are. Let's say you grew up in a home where you were punished or ignored if you expressed anger or even disagreement. That experience, those relationships, formed certain ideas in your very young heart. So today, you may rarely feel the freedom to express anger or disagreement, even if it harms you to keep quiet, because you were formed in the idea that strong emotions and disagreements are quote-unquote bad. And as Dallas Willard noted, so discipleship is the progressive transformation of these hidden dark ideas into light ideas. It's a lifelong journey, and it involves us understanding the times and the areas in which we live, but also understanding the ideas and desires that sit at the bottom of our hearts and power us. Now, Jesus, being the greatest idea revolutionary in world history, challenged and transformed both ideas in the air and ideas in the soil. He challenged and defeated all sorts of dark assumptions in the religious and cultural environment he was born into, and he invited scores of individuals to embrace his ideas in their soils, in their hearts. He was so effective at transforming ideas through his words and actions that he started a worldwide movement that continues its good, relentless impact today. So, because you and I are on a lifelong journey to become more like Jesus, we may also learn how to identify ideas in the air and in the soil and work to transform dark, deadly ideas into light ideas that lead to greater human flourishing. So let's get practical. Let's walk through an example of an idea in the air and an idea in the soil. So at the time of Christ, what were the unconscious assumptions, the ideas in the air about the value of women? And how did Jesus confront those ideas? Writer Rebecca McLaughlin quotes historian Tom Holland about the social assumptions, the ideas, regarding women at the time of Christ. Quote, that every human being possessed an equal dignity was not remotely a self-evident truth. She goes on, in Greco-Roman thinking, men were superior to women, and sex was a way to prove it. As captured cities were to the swords of the legions, so the bodies of those used sexually were to the Roman man, Holland wrote. To be penetrated, male or female, was to be branded as inferior. In Rome, men no more hesitated to use slaves and prostitutes to relieve themselves of their sexual needs than they did to use the side of the road as a toilet. The idea that every woman had the right to choose what happened to her body was laughable. End quote. That was the idea in the air. Women were worth far less than men and were tools and property to be used by them. Well, Jesus comes on the scene, and how did he confront this damaging idea of the air when he walked the earth? Quote, if we could read the Gospels through first century eyes, Jesus' treatment of women would knock us to our knees. His longest recorded conversation with any individual was with a Samaritan woman of ill repute. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Jesus repeatedly welcomed women his contemporaries despised, end quote. He healed the woman of blood and restored her to her community. He had a deep friendship with Mary and Martha. Women were welcomed and allowed to travel with Jesus and his disciples. Female donors supported their movement. Now, how did Jesus, the Son of God, come to earth? Through a woman. The very first people to see him resurrected? Women. As McLaughlin notes, Jesus made time for women and treated them with care and respect. It's sometimes hard for us to comprehend the revolutionary manner in which Jesus challenged ideas in the air about women when he walked here, because we live, at least in this part of the world, in an area that has been deeply impacted over the last few thousand years by his ideas. And he didn't so much teach ideas of light about women, he lived them. The way he related to women and honored them was itself the catalyst by which corrupt ideas began to change. That's why women were so attracted to him in Christianity, particularly in the first few hundred years after his earthly life. And yet, we still suffer from bad ideas in the air regarding women even now. Women in our culture continue to be objectified, abused, demeaned, exploited, sometimes disregarded. Is it as overt as it was 2,000 years ago? No, probably not. Has there been good progress? Yeah, certainly. Are we there yet? No. So how might we, like Jesus, be regarding this idea in the air? How might we live in such a way that women are valued and honored so that the dark ideas in culture are transformed into light ideas? Jesus' treatment of women was considered radical in his day. Is there still room for us to value and treat women in a radically positive way that will spread through families and into the 7 mountains of culture? Well, it starts in the home, of course. How husbands treat females in our own homes is crucial to social transformation. And this is where we as men are invited to do a little soul searching. Do we truly value women the way that Jesus does? Are our assumptions about our wives in line with Jesus' assumptions about our wives? Or if we're honest, are our hearts rooted in some dark ideas? Do we sometimes treat our wives and daughters as less valuable than us? Do we sometimes view our wives as property to be used rather than fellow image bearers to be honored? Now, these bad ideas don't always show up in extreme cases such as abuse or neglect. They can show up quietly, very quietly, in our 8 indicators. Remember those from season 2, our thoughts, our emotions, our relationships, health, our behaviors, our words, and how we use time and money. So, do we habitually talk over and interrupt our wives? Do we really listen to them when they pour their hearts out to us? Do we value their input really on decisions? Do we trust them to manage time and money, or do we try to control things that we really shouldn't control? Do we value them enough to protect them when they put themselves at risk? Do we invite appropriate conflict, even though it's hard, because of our love for them? Ultimately, are our wives flourishing in our homes, or are they becoming less of who God made them to be because of our bad, sometimes subtle, underlying ideas? And yes, I'm talking about Christian homes. In the broader church and culture, how might we identify dark and light ideas in the air regarding the value of women? How are women portrayed and treated in the media that we consume, in the books we read, in the conversations we have at work, or even at church? Pornography addiction is damaging for a host of reasons, but one of them is that it spreads dark ideas about the value of women in what is supposed to be the safest, most secure place, the home. As we survey the 7 mountains of culture, and again, that's business, government, the arts, media, church, education, family, where might we find dark ideas about women, and how might we come together to transform those into light ideas? All right, that's an example of an idea in the air. Let's look at an idea in the soil. Now, it seems like virtually every recorded word we have of Jesus reveals something about him confronting an idea in someone's heart. It's really shocking when you read the Gospels. We've briefly mentioned it, but one of my favorite examples of Jesus's reorienting the ideas in someone's heart is that story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman in John 4. So let's see if we can kind of get into her heart a little bit, get a handle on what sort of ideas were governing her, and why she showed up in the heat of the day at the well to fill her water pot. Back in season 1, we talked about these 6 core ideas. These tend to be the major categories of ideas that have the greatest influence on how you and I operate in the world. So here are the 6 core ideas. Identity, who are we? Anthropology, what are we? Value, what are we worth? Power, what authority do we really have? Purpose, why are we here? And love, what or whom do we really desire? So let's take a look at the Samaritan woman and just pick 2. The ideas of identity and value. Can we learn from her story the assumptions that her heart was functioning from? So let's look at identity. Well, she was a Samaritan woman of ill repute. Those are 3 significant strikes to her identity. A Samaritan was a religious half-breed and shunned by the Jews. She was a woman, which we've already noted, placed her lower on the totem pole, and she had had several lovers, most likely resulting in her public disgrace, which is probably why she showed up in the heat of the day, rather than the cool of the morning when everyone else went to the well to get water for the day. She assumed she was a religious, social, and moral outcast. That was her identity. What about her ideas of value? How did her heart value herself? Well, it's pretty obvious. She didn't think she was valuable enough to be part of the broader community. She was aware Jews hated her, and she didn't even feel welcomed among her own people. So her heart assumed she was worth very little. That may also explain why she had had so many lovers. Women who bounce from man to man often do so because their hearts have been relationally formed in the idea they aren't worth enough to stay with one man. So, how did Jesus, the master idea revolutionary, change these 2 ideas in the woman's heart? Well, first, he spoke to her. Just the fact that a Jewish man engaged her in polite conversation was enough to set her back and cause her to question him. She was obviously used to being ignored, shunned, disregarded. The fact that Jesus spoke to her would have been a shock to her ideas of identity and value. Second, he honored her by engaging in a fairly detailed theological conversation. Most likely, if she had had any dealings with Jewish men, it wasn't to dialogue about where God should be worshipped and Jewish history and the Messiah. Jesus treated her like an intelligent, thoughtful person. Third, he invited her into her story. He revealed the number of husbands she had had as a means of encouraging her to look into her own heart. May have initially been making her uncomfortable because she abruptly changed the subject. And fourth, he revealed himself to her. It's likely this half-breed outcast was probably the first person outside of his own team to whom Jesus revealed himself as the Messiah. Sounds just like Jesus finding the least valuable, the most downtrodden person to become his first town missionary. He was always finding the underdogs and lifting them up. The woman's ideas of identity and value were immediately transformed from dark to light. How do we know? Well, just look at what she did next. It seems she never did get Jesus the drink he asked for because she dropped her water pot and headed into town. To do what? To engage with the very people she had been avoiding. Her idea of identity was transformed from a lonely outcast to an insider. She was now in God's inner circle. Her idea of value was transformed from a worthless woman unworthy of being spoken to a spokesperson of extraordinary worth. A wonderful story of the transformation of ideas. So, being students of Jesus, spreading his kingdom today, what might we learn from this story? How might we be on the lookout for people whose core ideas of identity, value, power, purpose have been corrupted and damaged by their own stories, and how might we engage them and invite them to experience the transformation of those ideas? Well, we should probably start with ourselves. If we were to just take a look at a few of the 6 core ideas and evaluate our unconscious conclusions about ourselves, what might we find? Do our assumptions about ourselves align with Jesus's assumptions about us? Like the woman at the well, do we live in a set of ideas that are actually harmful and exhausting? Or do we live in a set of ideas that are life-giving and spiritually energizing? Then we might observe the ideas of those closest to us, our spouses, our kids, our parents, close friends. If we listen and observe closely the way that Jesus does, do we find evidence through those 8 indicators of some dark ideas in our loved ones? If you've ever read Les Miserables or watched the movie or seen the Broadway show, there are all sorts of examples of dark ideas being transformed into light ideas. The idea transformation that kicks off the movie is an act of mercy shown by a priest to the lead character, Jean Valjean. Valjean has just been released from an awful, painful, long prison sentence for some petty crime, and he's embittered and desperate and angry. He steals candlesticks from a church where the priest serves, but is quickly caught. When the police bring Valjean back to the priest to confirm the crime, the priest instead claims he gave Valjean the valuable items, and he wishes him well. Valjean goes free, overwhelmed by this act of extraordinary kindness and generosity. The priest's actions confront and transform the corrupted ideas in Jean Valjean's heart. He's transformed from a persecuted, worthless, rejected convict to a man of honor and conviction because his heart experienced a relationship that reset his damaging ideas. Becoming an idea revolutionary like Jesus requires a very careful, curious heart. It involves very intentional listening. It means we pay attention, special attention, to the ideas in the air, in church and culture, while also paying special attention to the words and the behaviors and the emotions and the habits of those closest to us. As we grow to become more like Jesus, we will learn to spot dark and light ideas in all 7 mountains of culture, and by observing the 8 indicators in the hearts of those around us, and yes, in our own hearts. And then, just like Jesus, we may find ourselves with many opportunities to use our words, our actions, our relationships, our resources to invite someone into deeper discipleship, into the transformation of ideas, knowing that as we become more and more filled with ideas of light, our lives will lead to greater blessing and human flourishing in Jesus' kingdom. Hey, thanks for being with me today. I hope this mini-series on a few characteristics of a deep disciple has been helpful. We'd love to hear from you. If it has been, just drop us an email at fish@soilandroots.org. You can find more about the ministry of Soil and Roots at soilandroots.org. The podcast and the blog are there, as is information about greenhouses and other free resources. If you'd like to financially support Soil and Roots and our work cultivating deep discipleship, you can give safely and securely at the website. And thanks in advance. If you're interested in the Soil and Roots book, you can just search for it at Amazon.com. Soil and Roots is on the major social platforms. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And we just opened up a site on Substack. Just search for Soil and Roots or Soil and Roots Podcast. Thanks so much for being with me today, and we'll see you next time.